country. This is nationwide. It's something that's ailed us since the inception of the country. And law enforcement is really a manifestation of what the issue is in our country, the illness in our country. And so incidents like George Floyd, as tragic as they were, and as hard as it is for us to watch something horrific like that, is really the match that's lit onto the kindling. And the kindling is our everyday interactions. And what ails our country are differences and race and those sort of things that play a part in our everyday interactions between law enforcement and community.
You have a unique perspective on the protests and what is happening in the country right now. You've been police chief there for about 3 years, and in that time, an unarmed black man, Stephon Clark, was shot multiple times in his grandmother's backyard. This was in 2018 by police who confused his cell phone for a handgun. Those officers were cleared of wrongdoing. What did you learn from that as law enforcement across the country is now facing demands for change?
Yeah, not only have I been at chief for 3 years, but I've come up in this department. I've lived in the city my entire life. I was arrested for assault on an officer when I was 16. So there's many different ways that I have a little bit of a unique perspective on our city. But they're both similar in one way and dissimilar in others. But the similar way is they're examples of what ails us in our country in terms of people's belief that the police department treats everybody fairly and that it's equitable. And we see what happens when these incidents occur, that we have protests, we have at times they get violent, and it's because people are so frustrated and so angry and they don't feel like anything is changing. And so then we see this unrest in our cities.
And look, some of the change that's being called for now in response to this is defunding, dismantling police departments. I was just speaking with the head of the NAACP in Minneapolis, who is very, very focused on this. For most people, that conversation means reshaping and redirecting funds. Yes, for some it means completely dismantling police departments. But when you hear that calls for dismantling, defunding police departments, what does it mean to you?
Well, that's a good question, because I don't know what it means. I mean, obviously I know what defunding means, cutting budgets, but I don't know what completely eliminating a police department means. Our personnel respond to over 175,000 calls a year, which is 400 and some calls a day. Those are community members calling for our assistance. We respond to over 12,000 mental health calls a day. And so we do a lot of stuff around relationships, implicit bias. We have a ton of training and how we integrate community into the police department and the police department into the community one at a time before they even get their uniform on. I would say the thing that I think would absolutely help is there is a lot of calls and a lot of issues in our community that the police department handles that, quite frankly, we shouldn't. There's a lot of mental health calls that we go to that police officers don't need to be there. There's a lot of homeless type calls that we go to that police officers don't need to be there, but nobody knows who to call other than us. There's no other resources that can come and deal with the situation. So the fallback is police officers. I think one of the ways we can get a lot better is that we get the people that are best suited to respond to some of these things to go there as opposed to police officers. And so in the meantime, we hire a social worker, we create a mental health team. For example, a lot of our officers involved shooting, a good portion of them involve people in mental health crisis. So I think there's a lot of ways we can improve by getting people that are more equipped, better equipped to provide the help that people need and have them respond as opposed to a police officer.
And Chief, I also want to get you kind of pointed to this in something you said just a moment ago about the ills of society and part of where this conversation is right now, because this is a big question now confronting the country. Systemic racism in the country, systemic racism in law enforcement. Several administration officials just this weekend were asked about this, and over from the Attorney General to the Acting Homeland Security Secretary, Chad Wolf, says they do not think that we have a systemic racism problem with law enforcement officers across the country. That is specifically what the DHS Secretary said. I want to ask you, do you think there is a systemic problem of racism, systemic racism problem in law enforcement today?
Well, I'd answer that this way, because I don't know to what extent, but But we have racism, we have implicit bias, we have biases in society, and whatever we have in society, we're going to have in our law enforcement ranks. And so we do extensive backgrounds, but there's absolutely no reason to believe that whatever in society is at least in some proportion in law enforcement. And that's why in Sacramento we spend so much time on implicit bias training and integrating our community into the police department. We bring a group called Brother to Brother and to teach at the academy, and all of them have been in prison so they can humanize folks and hear real stories and build relationships. And they actually do respond to calls. We might have somebody detained that we think would be better suited for them to help, and so we don't take them to jail. We call groups like Brother to Brother to come get them. So we've been working on things like that, but I would not ever be naive enough to believe that if there's biases and racism in the larger society, that there's no way it can't be in law enforcement.
The first way to begin rooting something out is to call it what it is. That's for sure. Chief, thank you very much for coming on. Appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
Coming up next, New York City.